And we're back with The Forests at Night. We are joined tonight for this interview not by a metal musician, but as somebody that... Actually, let me read you that. That's the other nice part, is if I fuck up on the intros, I can just restart it and edit it out. So 3, 2, 1, go. And we're back on The Forests at Night. I am joined tonight not by a musician, but by one of the more interesting authors that I've had the pleasure of coming across, and by somebody that is creating a fantasy series that makes a point to include everyone. Please welcome J.L. Johnson of Ennead, The Rule of Nine.
Thank you for having me. You make the title of my series sound way cooler than I do. And you say it.
Well, I am available for audiobooks. You have adapted.
I was just gonna say, we might have to have that conversation offline.
J.L. Johnson is the writer of the series Ennead, The Rule of Nine, which is now on Kickstarter. And I'll let you tell the folks what it's about and what y'all about.
So, Ennead, The Rule of Nine is the way I often describe it, my love letter to the fantasy genre. I grew up loving fantasy despite seeing folks who look like me in the stories. And when the time came and I couldn't keep this story in, I knew that I needed to tell a story that made it clear that representation matters. I needed a story that made it clear that I was trying to re-envision the fantasy genre for the modern and diverse audience that I hope will find this story. So Ennead, The Rule of Nine, the almost elevator pitch is more like long walk to your car after dinner pitch, because it's a little longer than an elevator ride. But major characters, Queen Ilaria Shadoon, she is the granddaughter of Athenia Shadoon. Athenia Shadoon led the secession from the Dabashi Empire and founded the first Ennead under the Rule of Nine. The Rule of Nine states that for 3 generations, 9 noble houses will rule the Republic Kingdom of Athea. Upon the death of the 3rd generation monarch, which Ilaria Shadoon is, power must go back to the people, and people must elect the next 9 houses to become the next Ennead to rule for the next 3 generations, therefore resetting the Rule of Nine. So Queen Ilaria Shadoon is navigating this. She is the first queen raised to rule, destined to abdicate her power. And she's navigating this while also trying to successfully lead her nation, her country, through the end of the war that her grandmother started. On the flip side, and almost on the ground, you have Anatu Kinnisk. Anatu Kinnisk is a jaded soldier from a foreign land who's just looking for peace. He's retired from his service in the Kavanian Navy, and he has never been to the Republic Kingdom of Athea, and we explore why down the line. But he's never been there, but unfortunately for him, he chooses to visit right on the cusp of this, you could call medieval Cold War turning hot. And then above it all is Niawi of the Order of the Jade Crest. And Niawi is a member of the thought-to-be-extinct race, the Hlaven. Hlaven are Ennead's iteration of Elves. Niawi is a warrior. She has been trained to almost police dark magic within the world of Amashik. And years ago, hundreds of years ago, there was an event known as the Separation. And the Separation is not only responsible for the extinction of the Hlaven, but responsible for most folks thinking that the Hlaven split the world. The world experienced a great cataclysm, as the stories tell it, during this time. And the Hlaven basically went into hiding after that. And so now, for the first time in a long time, the Hlaven are re-entering the realms of men, because dark magic is re-entering the realms of men. And so what you have in Ennead, The Rule of Nine, is that classic setup in fantasy where you have these kind of disparate pieces on the map who are brought together for various reasons, whether they be geopolitical, ethereal, and magical. you know, just these similar class struggles, and so I get to play across these three different kind of planes of existence, as I call them, in fantasy. You got the magic and the ethereal, you've got the geopolitical and the castle politics, and then you've really got the class issues of folks on the ground. And so that gives me the opportunity to do what I'm setting out to do, which is make space for everyone, make space for as many voices as I can, and again, reimagine the fantasy genre, because one of the things that I love, and I'll cut it here because I could go on and on and on and on.
No, go on, go on.
Is that, you know, for me, fantasy is it's the biggest sandbox there is. You know, there are no rules. There are rules, but there are no rules. You make the rules. You set the rules. I'm not telling a crime thriller that has to take into consideration, you know, penal code in the United States of America, right? I'm telling a story in a world that I literally thought up. And who would I be to think up a world that wasn't as inclusive as the one I was lucky enough to grow up in? You know, I'm very conscious of that, and I think I have a responsibility as an author to not only on the page create that, but as we chatted about a bit offline, you know, the team that I bring together, I try to find as many different voices as I can who are willing to work with a first-time comic creator and writer that I am. And, you know, so that I think there's a richness to the world of Amashik already in these early stages because of that focus on what I think the fantasy genre, and by extension, the rest of the world needs, which is this desire to and ability to, as you mentioned, build community. You know, there's so many people that I've met during this journey who really resonate with that part of Ennead. And it's something that early on I knew I wanted to be a part of the world, but I also was hesitant to lean into. And over the last 2 years, I've really learned that not only that's why I'm telling the story first and foremost. Yes, I love fantasy. Yes, I wanted to always read my favorite fantasy novels in a comic, and I got tired of waiting for that, so I wrote one myself. But I'm really trying to do what I set out to do, you know, as a younger man, which is just build bridges, build communities, go places where folks have different experiences than I do, and connect. And I think that Amashik is a space that I hope folks will do that in. Ennead is a vehicle that I hope folks can use to see themselves and others in. And I really do hope that, you know, I listened to something today. You know, I listen to motivational speeches because I'm a cornball. But but I do, and
Sometimes you got to have that voice in you.
and sometimes, and I go through phases where I really need it sometimes, and other times I'm like, man, this is so corny, I have to stop. But like, one of the things today was just flat out, what do you want? Stop being shy about what you want. You have to be able to express what you want. And what I want is, I want Ennead the Rule of Nine to be a household name as far as fantasy worlds and fantasy stories are told, because of the inclusivity that I'm building into it. That's what I want, and that's why I want it. Because this is an opportunity where another kid like me who finds that they love fantasy and they love being in these other worlds, that they don't have to eventually come across that moment where they're like, well, what do people like me in this world do? People like me in this world treat it like I am in the real world? If so, do I really want to be in this world? Am I ashamed of being a fan of this genre? So I want to create a space where we don't have to do that anymore going forward.
Right. No, there's definitely, especially in a lot of high fantasy, which is why, you know, leads into my next question. There has been a racism problem in high fantasy, borderline since Tolkien. It's you often see races like goblins and what is the Harry Potter lady's name? I'm sorry, I ignore TERF, so I already forgot her name.
Honest,
but the Harry Potter series.
I've never even read Harry Potter. I honestly have never
Don't.
read it.
It's terrible.
And at this point, I'm not going to, right? But like, I legit never. Yeah. I missed that whole craze. I missed it all. Not because I'm too old or too young. I just didn't pick it up.
I had an ex that wrote Harry Potter fan fiction while being a trans woman, which I don't know why. I didn't understand why she did it at the time, but she explained to me that Harry Potter was such a terrible book that it spawned an entire fan fiction community dedicated to fixing the series because it was that bad. But in her work, you have the goblins, which are a stand-in for incredibly anti-Semitic Jewish stereotypes. You have dark elves and the implications of that get used quite a bit in a lot of fantasy realms. I've been playing a lot of Skyrim, so that's instantly coming to mind for me. You have all of these different race issues that are primarily written by a lot of cisgender, heterosexual white guys that are taking these issues and trying to make social commentary, usually wrong. And when they're not doing it wrong with good intentions, they're doing it wrong with bad intentions. So let's talk a bit about that. Because reading Ennead, the Rule of Nine, specifically the two issues, the first and second issues that you sent me, which are fantastically illustrated by Luke Horsman, you see a variety of different faces, a variety of different people, none of whom are making a point to comment on, aside from very specific things, each other's, fantasy race or anything to that effect. Was that a conscious decision, or did you want to approach that, or did you end up approaching that later on in the script and trying to make commentary about it? Because it is a delicate fucking line. Did you try to approach that, or did you sidestep it entirely?
That was absolutely intentional. It's actually one of the major deciding factors in putting off color in the book for so long. I talk about this rarely. I'm not something that I try to avoid talking about, but the black and white versus the color in the comic. It's a black and white book thus far. It will be colored for the first time. It is being colored for the first time right now by B. Navarro.
Honestly, I'm looking forward to seeing Navarro's colors, but I will say, if y'all pick up this book, make sure you read it in black and white first, because Horsman's use of screen tones is just, it's a masterclass. It's immaculate.
It's phenomenal. It's
very well done.
And going forward, it will always be done first and foremost in that way, and the idea is just to color it once the volumes are complete, just on a logistical side note. But absolutely, I wanted to approach it that way, and I mentioned to you also offline that I world built Amashik on its own. I love fantasy, so I like to go on websites and make maps, and I have a big giant whiteboard that I use for work that more often than not has coffee beans on it, and I'm drawing maps and tracing and just imagining these spaces and these places. And like I said, who would I be to imagine a space and place that was, when it comes to inclusivity and representation, is as shitty as the real world can be? Why would I do that? And so when I was even just building Amashik out and designing, the worship of the divine and the worship of Mother and the concept for a Republic Kingdom, which is what I think is a fairly novel approach to a loosely veiled kind of medieval government. Things like that. I made it, even in the origin story, I refer to the separation, I don't want to spoil anything there, but basically the reason why the separation is the cataclysm that everyone remembers is because that's the only reason why there's any literal separation in people at all. It was the event and the thing that led to that. That's probably where the most direct on the nose commentary will come, if it ever makes it to the comic page. If not, it'll end up in some interview somewhere one day, hopefully when this story is told, and I feel like that's a ways away. But I wanted to make sure that when one of the scenes you're referencing, Anatu Kinnis, who's my main character, who in our world is coded as an African-American man. But in Amashik, there's no such distinction. But because of the way he wears his hair and because of some other distinguishing features, including the weapon that he carries, people know right away that he's from the islands of Cabana. And so they refer to him as a pagan in one of the opening scenes in the book. And that's because in the Republic Kingdom of Athea, they believe that the divine spoke directly to that original founding Ennead, those 9 noble houses, and the divine led them to secede from the Dabashi Empire. So they're a religious kind of nation state. And so isn't his blackness that they're judging him for, because blackness is as a construct doesn't exist in Amashik. And that's not because I want to ignore that racism exists in the real world. It's that as a black man, um, I understand racism in a very visceral way. As as a trans woman, I know that I assume you understand anti-trans and transphobic folks and things like that in a very visceral way. So when you sit down to write, if you want to commentate on that, you don't need to be on the nose. You can thread a very particular needle. So that scene in particular is one that I know you've seen. And then there's another one in book two where again it's like if you're just if uh, I think about Jay-Z, do you fools listen to music or do you just skim through it, right? It's like if you're just skimming through Ennead, you think that what's going on early on is commentary about race. It's not. Well, at the same time, it is because inevitably, um, our experience here in the States is coded in racist and white supremacist, ideology, whether we like it or not. So yes, I'm very consciously threading that needle because there's some big aha moments where it's almost like I break the fourth wall, so to speak. I let you know, like, no, see, I wasn't. It's not what I was doing, but see what you were doing, and see how you were approaching the world, and see how you were, kind of bringing your experiences to kind of muddy up these waters. And so, yes, I'm very conscious of that. And it's one of the things that I care deeply about is making sure that we can discuss things like class difference, like religious difference, and the prejudices and the nuances there that aren't prejudice, but just kind of tolerant spaces and things like that. I want to be able to discuss those as ideas, and I want to use this book to do that. But I want to make sure that we almost filter out our own coding all along the way.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, and it's very interesting the way you've designed the world, especially by using black and white to not necessarily hide, but obfuscate things of that nature, because it very much mirrors how I approach illustration myself. A lot of my portraits in fine art work are portraits of trans folk that you would not immediately look at and identify as trans folk if you're not trans. And the reason I say that is because as a trans woman, I know exactly what trans feminine bodies look like. So instead of explicitly saying this is this gender, like for Elle in my series, The Grizzly Private Eye, which is coming out later this year, thanks to Bear Creek. Volume 1 is coming out thanks to Bear Creek. It's been published in Bear Creek Magazine, or Bear Creek Gazette this whole time. Check those guys out if you haven't already, by the way. But Elle is explicitly trans feminine. I don't show that or mention it explicitly because it's not an issue. Because she is a person. She's a character with her own interesting things to say and her own interesting way of being in the world. And that's the way that, I sidestep a lot of this stuff, not necessarily by abjectly avoiding it, but by making it so that it's not a fucking issue. It's, there's a lot of, in the later issues of The Grizzly, there's a lot of subtext and a lot of explicit text about Elle and Geoff's relationship and about Geoff being openly gay and Elle being trans that, comes up. But the way you're presenting it, I would say is a fucking masterclass on how to do it well. So
I really appreciate that. One of the things that I find really difficult to do because of my particular lens, right, is just what you're describing. And he's not the only person of color in the story, far from it, but he is the one that I feel the most directly connected to. His experience is most like mine, and again, not because he's a black man, but it's so. You talked about coming to art because you're emotional. So I feel like I'm going to get emotional for a second, but I think about where he is, and without spoiling his character and too many things, and not to as someone who is at this point in his life cut off from his family. He knows where they are, could be with them, but that tie has been severed. So he's alone in the world, and he's trying to make his way. And if I flip that back on myself, that is what makes Anatu and I the same. That is why Anatu exists as a character, because telling his story is cathartic for me. And quite frankly, an artist and a writer, you recognize this. You know the broad strokes where your story is going, but you don't know where it's going to end up. And I know where Anatu is going. But I really genuinely don't know where he's going to end up. I don't know who he's going to be when he gets there. And in a way, it gives me an opportunity to see where I'm going to be as this individual who, again, is in ways cut off from his family. I could reconnect, but there are some things that have happened. There are some things that have been said, some things that have been done that almost make that impossible on a deeper level. At least until I become a big enough person to get over it, right? Until I become the person who bends over backwards to do. Oh, and I'm saying these things with air quotes, right? Like, I don't think I should have to be, but so long story short, Natu and his experience easily, I think, can be misread because I hope it comes off as so human and so relatable. So you see a black man who is alone in the world as far as you understand it. And so you just basically write in everything that you think you know about the black experience in America. Because of course, if the author's a black person writing it, that's what they're doing. And so it's one of those I have these moments when I'm writing his story where I have to be careful. It's very difficult because again, I have that experience too. And it's very difficult, especially in book 2. There's a very big connection between the events in the Bard's Inn in book 1 and the events at Cunningham Estates in book 2. Very big connection. And some of it is very, very clear, and some of it is, hopefully a little better disguised. But, that's going to shape Anatu's experience in the Republic Kingdom. And I intentionally make that look like it's something that it isn't. Because, again, I have some aha moments along the way where I hope that people recognize, like, oh, that was me. That was me.
Yeah.
Maybe I do need to do some work about how I view, black folks and how I view marginalized folks and because I did so much, and this is me taking the position of a reader who doesn't know what I'm doing. And I'm doing my best not to spoil this. So if I am not making sense, you can tell me later. But like, that's my intention, is that folks close the book one day and almost like, did you read The Walking Dead?
Bits and pieces,
Well,
yeah.
all right. Well, spoiler. Sorry. 3, 2, 1. Almost like when Glenn dies, right? Glenn gets this fucking head
Right.
bashed in. I remember closing the book and sitting back, and it's one of those moments that we've all had as readers where we're like, "Man, I don't know if I can open that up again." Like it was so hard hitting. And what I'm trying to, I hope to have a moment like that, but it's not necessarily because of anything that happened on the page. It's because when I reveal what I reveal, hopefully so many folks have gone down this path with Anatu, thinking about him in this particular way, and then they realize, oh shit, I've got work to do. And it's not going to be, the story's not going to be over, but it's just going to be that kind of light bulb moment where you look back and you're like, oh wow, that was me. That isn't what I was reading. Why was that me? Why did I think that way? So I appreciate you noticing that. I appreciate you complimenting me on that, because that is something that is very near and dear to his character and to the role that he plays in The Rule of 9.
Well, let's feed into that. You mentioned something we had talked about before actually formally starting this interview. You mentioned that as artists, we come to this with emotion. You don't become, which feeds back into something we were talking about before with the interview started. You don't become an artist unless you know and understand emotion, unless you need that outlet. Both of us have a decent amount, or have had a decent amount, and continue to deal with a decent amount of mental health issues. I'm a recovering alcoholic. You had mentioned you struggled with addiction in the past. We've both talked about privately both of our battles with mental illness and anxiety. And the reason I bring this up now is because you had mentioned that, to no small degree, the hero's journey present in the book is meant to help you work out your own feelings on certain subjects. There's an element with serialization, especially in early like high fantasy staples like Conan the Barbarian, Vampirella to a lesser degree, other war and comics kind of staples, and even with a lot of stuff now, with me and my partner Autumn writing The Grizzly and you writing Ennead, where a lot of us come up with an idea. And we come up with this idea in a part of our lives where we need that idea. We need this character. And as we're developing these books, we go on our, hero's journey with the character. For instance, in The Grizzly, it's not mentioned yet, but there is a huge substance abuse problem with a decent amount of the characters in The Grizzly. Geoff himself, the main character, struggled with alcohol abuse. And I want to ask, does that feed into how you've written the characters in Ennead? Does this feed into how you've written their individual hero's journey? Do you see your depression in them? Do you see them battling with, substance abuse or the same kind of demons that you do?
Absolutely. I talk about Anatu because Anatu showed up in later drafts of the story. Anatu was not initially a part of the Rule of Nine. And it was a response to some early readers' critiques of the story itself feeling disjointed. And so I needed an avatar basically to drive readers through the world. And then I needed to bring life to him. And so that was when I decided to do some of the things that I do with him and connect his story so closely to mine. But before there was an Anatu, there were King Ulysses' sons and Queen Alaria's sons as well, Micah and Eudonis. And so, in effect, Micah and Eudonis and their relationship with their father is my relationship with mine. And so, very much so. A lot of my characters are, a lot of authors talk about this, and I'm a very, very big Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire, George R. R. Martin fan, and I reference him a lot. But he talks about having a little bit of himself in all of his characters, but he feels most like Tyrion. And I could say the same thing. There's a little bit of me in each and every one of the characters that I write, and even the folks who have not the best intentions in any of the Rule of Nine. I think about myself when I'm operating in stress and I'm operating in anxiety and I'm operating, in a space where I'm battling, depression right around the corner. And I think about how I handle the world and how I shut it out and push it away and lash out. And I write that. And so just to touch on the two brothers, because again, this goes along something that you've already read, the opening scene in the book, the Micah, the older of the two, the shame and the way that his father reacts to his failure is something that is deeply personal to me. And I know my father. We have a relationship, and we're working through it. It's something that we struggle to talk about, but we're working through it. And I hope that we can come to a space where we can figure things out, especially now that I have a daughter. And again, I could go down a big rabbit hole there. But in terms of how it fits into the story, the way that their relationship develops is very much the way that my relationship with my father developed in my early 20s. It's that moment where, and this isn't really spoilery, but it will say a lot to you who've read a little bit of the world. It's that moment in time where Prince Micah realizes he doesn't need to be his father's son. That's not his identity. That is not going to be his most that's not going to be what he's known for. And if you think back to how I opened the story, and something tells me with the way you're quoting things left and right here that you remember, but there's a bit about what will create his son's legacies. And he says, my actions won't, after going on and on about what they owe to their mother and her name and her legacy and her lineage, and the fact that what he has earned and what he's worked for can't be passed to them, so they have to build their own legacies. That's very much a split that I had to make. I had to decide, you're right, I'm not going to be defined by your actions, therefore why should I let your expectations dictate mine, and so that's very much another one of those spaces and places where things are very personal to me. And then just a really quick one, Queen Ilaria, she is probably the character that I've spent the most time with, um, who that's yet to be seen as for when you've read, as far as you've read. You did read book two though, so there's the scene where she's sparring with that's Sir Celigus. That is her, the head of her guard, and they've known each other for a long time, and explore that relationship in various ways as well. But she is the character who is the. There's so much of my personality that I realized was a trauma response, and I only realized that as I got older. But so much of my personality, and I think all of us can say this, so much of my personality is a very distinct trauma response, and a lot of it is wanting to be seen who I am in the world and wanting to lean into what I view as my complexity and what makes me different. But ultimately, you've seen me before. And I think that Queen Ilaria is very much that character. She's doing things and behaving in ways that like a person who's trying to separate themselves from what people expect them to be. And what do people expect her to be? Well, she's the granddaughter of the woman who fucking started the whole thing. Like, her grandmother is it. She's the one. Her picture is in everybody's fucking living room. There's no Jesus. It's Athenia, right? Like, and so, who is Ilaria? Who is Ilaria under such a big, big shadow? And so she's doing. Not only is she trying to, live up to that legacy because she doesn't want the Republic Kingdom to fall, she's also trying to make clear and really for herself and for her people who she is. And so I explore a lot of that in the later issues. That a lot of she comes kind of roaring back into the story after the first two issues, around book 7, 8, and beyond. And so that's just three different ways that very much my experience in the world and things that are connected to my traumas, big and little t, how they play out.
And that's part of, growing through traumas. Like you mentioned on the website, everyone has their own justification for their actions. Some are motivated by hatred, others by compassion, manipulated by forces beyond their control. You may not agree with them, they may not always align with your sense of morality, but they don't have to, nor should they. By the way, I'd imagine we're going to go for a minute, but listeners, I would highly encourage you to be readers and head over to enneadcomic.com. That is ENNEADCOMIC.com. Scroll down to the bottom of the page, enter your email address. You can read book 1 for free and download this while you're listening to us talk, because I highly recommend following that bouncing ball. But yeah, or, to quote the comic itself, order can only shape that which chaos creates. We had talked a bit, as I keep alluding to before the show, and one of the things we had mentioned and that we had kind of bonded over for a second there, I'm a practicing Stoic. I took an oath of nonviolence at one point, and I often credit it for being the reason why I'm not dead or in jail right now. And the reason I took that oath of nonviolence is because I read, when I was homeless and at one of the lowest points of my life, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, along with 2 other books, both Zen Buddhist texts. You had mentioned that you used to carry around a copy of Meditations with you, and that's part of how you met your wife. But that love of philosophy and that, idea of exploring the human psyche from a more philosophical perspective and dealing with these heavy issues permeates the entirety of this world. I hope that doesn't change, but where do you see it going? We have a society full of warriors and a society full of, people who have fought to survive this entire time. So I would imagine that currently we're going off of, Stoicism, like Marcus Aurelius' Meditations was written on the battlefield as his life and his empire was crumbling around him. That meditation upon stoicism in the face of losing. We have, I would imagine that Musashi's The Book of Five Rings and the philosophies in that particular sect of Zen Buddhism, plays a part. Where do your philosophical, inspirations lie later on in the series when everything comes to a head? Do you say with that warrior poet archetype, or do you imagine going somewhere a bit more existential?
What I keep alluding to the conversation we had offline, but it genuinely is a good conversation. And actually, I might have said this after record. I don't know. Who knows? Long day. But the point is, I definitely said this after recording. I know where the story is going, but I don't know where it's going to end up. And I want to answer that. I do have an actual answer about the philosophy.
Do you think that'll grow as you're growing?
Yes, and I know where it's growing because I know how I grew philosophically, right? But I also don't know how these characters are going to respond to my growth philosophically, if that makes sense without spoiling anything. So, but I do have an answer, and you actually kind of hit the nail on the head. You could see, it's not an arc bending towards justice; it's an arc bending towards existentialism. I'll answer it like that, right? Just because that could be a really, really big rabbit hole for us. But that to me is the simplest way to say it. But I also want to just point out
that rabbit hole opens the door for you to come back later on the show.
And so hopefully you know by now that I'm going to point to the rabbit hole and then I'm going to swan dive into it.
Yeah. Good.
Just to be clear, I'm definitely not going to avoid it. But I want to kind of say a few things before I really jump into it. And it's that, one, it means the absolute world to me that you can sense that and that you can pick that up, because that scene that you quoted, order can only shape that which chaos creates. That was the original opening scene of the series. It was Ilaria and her mother playing a game that I had created. I'm blank on the name. I created a game, a chess-like game, just so I could play out the actions of that conversation. The way I do with that duel, I played it out over this almost game of chess. And I got some really good advice that was a really dull way to start a comic series. No one's going to open up your comic series and want to read philosophy. At least it seems like you might have. So thank you. But that scene in particular is so important to me, and it's so important to Ilaria, and it's so layered, and so it means the world to me that you can pick that up. It means the world to me, and not like you're smart enough to pick it up, but like that resonated with you, right? Like I hope that those are the things that people who read Ennead pick up, and not the one or two times that Luke ignored my advice to put cleavage on one of my characters and things like that. Like I don't want those things, and whatever floats your boat, right? But I don't want the pomp and circumstance and the sex and the blood to sell Ennead. The fact that you said to me that philosophy permeates the world, it means a lot emotionally, but it also means a lot. It's such a huge compliment, and so I really genuinely, I was floored by that, and I appreciate that so much that's why I avoided the rabbit hole up until now. But to jump into the rabbit hole,
we all about rabbit holes in this show.
Existentialism. There's a name, Martin Heidegger. It's one that I bring up a lot, and I often get crickets. But you could a literal and figurative student of Hegel's, and Martin Heidegger has this concept of I almost said athletic design. That's my spin on it. That's another thing that I did in a podcast that I wrote and produced. I'm a fitness coach during the day. So I took his concept and spun it that way. But Dasein, and Dasein roughly translates to being in time. And he has this concept of at-handedness. And there's some things that are very important to focusing on the task at hand. And it's ignoring the idle chatter of others, recognizing that on the flip side of every decision that we make is the fact that we could die in that moment. And then you round that out with the real understanding that it is the task at hand or the thing that we are focused on that defines us. And so, a hammer is only defined by a nail. If there were no nails, a hammer would be a a useless tool. You could find other things to do with it, but it would lose its meaning, it would lose its purpose. And so it's kind of that triad approach to existing in the world that really has gotten me through since I discovered it, since I read it. And the book is literally called Being in Time, if you were interested. So you think about that, right? And then you go back to what I said I was trying to do, which is have this arc that bends towards existentialism. And you actually quoted the website, which kudos, thank you.
I'm trying to get people to read it.
I mean, hey,
it's a good book.
You're making me want to read it, and I wrote it. Again, I appreciate that. But what I say in that little kind of blurb on the website is really important. It's almost, if you could, someone like you up with and we've only been talking for maybe about 2 hours now, on and off. But I think that you can kind of get what I'm putting down when I lay out those 3 lanes of this particular branch of existentialism. I'm sure you could take a pretty good swing at where my story is going now. Again, not necessarily where each character is going to end up at the end of it, but definitely you can kind of see a little bit further down the highway now, so to speak. At least I would assume you could.
I've got some educated guesses. So you mentioned Jay-Z earlier.
Yeah.
So let's bring it back to what the radio show is actually about, and it's about extreme music, or music in general. Because at this point, we don't just play black metal. I mean, hell, we literally sell a shirt in the merch shop that I have set up that literally just says, describes The Forest at Night as a jazz show with a black metal problem. So we're a bit past black metal and all of that. But as I alluded to quite a bit earlier in the before times, when we were talking before we started recording this, high fantasy and extreme music, specifically black metal, go hand in hand. There's a joke that if there's a word in the Lord of the Rings that was printed in the Lord of the Rings, it's a black metal band. You can just cut your copy of The Hobbit or The Similarium or Return of the King in a little word things, put them on a dartboard and start chucking darts at it. As long as it doesn't end up on the word the, you'll hit a black metal band that exists. Black metal and high fantasy go hand in hand. And you had mentioned that there's one specific fan of yours who is a huge black metal kid that knows more about the series than most of the artists do?
Yeah. Shout out to Mark Kaplan. I'll definitely get him to listen. But he's a huge fan of the series, and again, I feel weird saying that people are my friends without running it by them. But I do feel like Mark and I are friends, so hopefully we are, Mark. Right? It's when you buy and sell things on the internet, and that's kind of the primary means of meeting people. You feel it. I do feel like Mark is a friend of mine, but I also feel like I don't want to come off as skeevy and creepy, oh, yeah, we're friends, right? But that's a weird tangent, but I'm good for those. But the point,
we're all in the same industry. You got to have those friendships. Yeah. You got to have that. Otherwise, it's like any other job. You got to have those friendships in the industry. You go fucking crazy.
Yeah. And so definitely. And Mark does this really cool thing where he pairs beers with comics, pairs beers with black metal music. So I legitimately don't know much about it, but other than what he posts and the clips and the songs, and so, but when you say you throw a dart, throw a dart at a board with anything from anything under the Tolkien umbrella, I immediately jump back to also what you said, some of the coded, some of the problems with high fantasy and racism and isms and galore.
Very much still a thing in black metal and extreme music. The same kind of crowds that are putting forward these incredibly racist memes about elves or Warhammer 40K on your local Twitter, your social media feed, are the same exact kids that are going to white nationalist metal programs. It's a problem in extreme music, and that's why this show exists in the first place, to tell those kids to fuck off. Well, and I think
about one of the things that comes up so early on, and it's the Black Riders, and like I imagine there's got to be a metal band out there with the name Black Rider at this point, especially if you're telling me they're so connected and it's kind of on the nose. But like, you know,
I mean, much like fantasy too, the kicker with black metal is, if I can inject here, one of the bands that literally, laid the foundations for extreme music was a black run, black owned, black performers metal band, Death. Like, we would not have extreme music without Death, point blank.
And so, there's so many instances of that, right? And I think, for me, again, as a black man, telling a high fantasy story, to act as though these things don't exist and not, it would be a mistake. But again, I don't want to then turn around and just give you what you expect. My experience is my experience, and my experience in the world is, as the individual. I've only ever been me, and I've only ever been a black man in the United States of America in the time in which I've existed. But this doubles back to something that's really big in Martin Heidegger's work, and it's just that, like, our existence. He has this other phrase that he uses a lot, is throne potentiality. And part of it is throne. We didn't choose our parents. We didn't choose the decade we were born in. We didn't choose the culture we were born into. We didn't choose any of that. Just beyond the edges of all the things that we didn't choose is infinite potential. So when you think about, my role as a writer and someone who is kind of the key cog in bringing these different people with these different perspectives to the same table to work together on the same book, that to me is that infinite potential. That's what it's all about. Like, why wouldn't I reach out to different people with different experiences to help me tell this story the way that it should have been told? I mean, let's face it, we're talking about a world where magic exists and orcs can exist and elves can exist. Do we really need it to also include, racism as we understand it today? Or could we come up with another way for that very human tendency that we have to create tribes and create distance when resources are scarce? Like, can't we do that another way? And so
I would honestly argue that, like, if you're a fucking fantasy author or in any kind of, SFF adjacent genre, and you give yourself that kind of limitless potential, including fucking direct allegories, to fucking, like, shit like that, instead of actually trying to create a better and more, better world and a better way of going about it, is fucking lazy writing.
Yeah.
You have everything in the world to go with. Why would you just try to clumsily replicate the same exact pains?
It's one of those,
especially because a lot of the idiots doing that shit are like, fucking cisgender heterosexual white kids.
It's one of those things that's very, I wouldn't, and I'm not going to name any names, but you said to me, like, you talk about yourself doing underground comics, not indie comics, and I feel like I want to jump on that bandwagon, even though I'm not doing it all, right? I'm writing, I'm doing the lettering at this point now, and but I'm not doing it all. I wish sometimes I wish I could, but that's also why I pivoted to trying to just start putting out prose in this world and under this umbrella, because there's so much that I want to do. There's so many things that I do want to bring to readers, because I agree with that wholeheartedly. Like, there's so many people who are just being lazy because they can be lazy. Because they can get away with it, because you code something the right way, you put it in front of people with a holographic cover or like a spot foil cover, and people lose their shit over it. And
Harry Potter. Excuse me, I had a bullshit stuck in my throat.
And so, but if it weren't for the fact that those same individuals on the other side of it were just looking for a space to get lost in, a space to imagine freely in, then these worlds wouldn't exist, right? So it's like, rather than just forcing them this ham-fisted attempt at, kind of, I think about like Mr. Potato Head, right? Like, they're just trying to pull these weird pieces and put them together, and you got the eye where the mouth should be and the ear where the foot should be, and like, just how about you do something fresh and unique and stop doing that? Like, I know we can get away with it, but it just, for me, it means so much to me that one you are able to, and you can come to any kind of fresh and out of the blue, like you know, and pick those things up. It really means a lot because that's what's most important to me about this world. It's not that it's just a cookie cutter fantasy. It's not. I'm trying to. This is a very ambitious project, and wouldn't be me if I didn't approach it that way. But it just means so much to me. This is literally the space that I've gone to imagine the world that could be, right? And it wouldn't be a world without flaws, because the only world without flaws is, the one that doesn't exist, right? So like it wouldn't. I'm not trying to do that. There are very, very deep problems that some of these characters have, and King Julius is a very, very violent man, and he has a lot of power, and we know that that typically doesn't go well for people without power. So like there's a lot that I can and plan to do with these characters, but first I want to make sure that as readers, I grab your attention a little bit, and that's because like maybe the man with almost unlimited power and kind of predisposition to violence, maybe he's not going to do what most men in his position have done throughout history. Maybe he's going to fool you, or maybe he's just that guy, and maybe that's the fun ride in the story. Like I really look forward to that moment, and those are the moments in the story that I'm the most excited about, because I'm purposefully playing with everybody's again predisposition to do that, to take their own coding, their own experience, and put it into my world, so I can then in some instances pull the rug out from under you, and other instances kind of pat you on the back for figuring it out. Like that's the fun for me. So I'm very much, I'm thankful that I've been able to make it this far with Kickstarter and things like that, because it's just given me the room to do all of this.
I mean, I would personally argue that you're giving me too much credit to, go back and quote Jay-Z. I think it's obvious to anybody that's reading it and not skimming it. Like I do want to highly recommend, go to the website, pick up issue 1 or book 1 as it's called, and then once you read that, you're going to go to the Kickstarter. You're going to back this, because this is some good shit.
If I may,
but
just another way,
yeah.
So I don't know if this is on or off, but I mentioned Substack, yeah. And I know that Substack has a bit of a problem with the folks that it allows on its platform, and some of the things that it allows to be said to understate it. But I only say it that way because I honestly haven't done my due diligence to really speak intelligently on it. I know there's a problem there, but my thinking. I'm going to do two things here. I'm going to talk about what I'm doing on Substack and why I brought it up when you brought up people trying to read book 1, but also why I am still choosing to bring this very story to that problematic platform. And it's because I believe that the only way, there are 2 ways, and we kind of talked about this. One of those ways involves people in the streets doing things that a lot of us are uncomfortable doing and would get in a lot of trouble for doing. That's one way that you take on some of these problematic things that are popping up once again here in the States.
Taking
recently.
On bigotry and all that.
Yeah, you can do that way, or you can do it by building a stronger and broader coalition that can drown it out. And I'm a true believer that you can do that. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm choosing to use that platform despite. But go ahead.
Well, let's expand upon that, actually, because point blank, Substack enables a lot of trans-exclusionary radical feminists, or TERFs, as they are rightfully called. I call them a few different names, but that goes back to there are 2 different ways to fight Nazis and TERFs, and one of those is socking them in the mouth, and the other is building community to avoid them. But that's kind of part of the issue with the modern, layout and the modern, not just for comics creators like, me and you, but for, musicians as well. Bandcamp was recently bought out by Epic, who will inevitably probably bring some very not creator-friendly things to the platform. Substack has a reputation for platforming white nationalists and TERFs. Kickstarter has recently, continuously shot themselves in the foot by doubling down on NFTs. And completely and utterly ignoring the ecological costs and a bunch of other negative elements to them, not to mention the backlash by creators and by their own audience for doing so. Gumroad did the same thing and went a step further by openly mocking a lot of artists who did not want anything to do with them, and by absolutely withholding payments. We had mentioned before the show, as we had mentioned, we talked a bit about philosophy, but we also talked a bit about how there's, to quote, the offset quote, no real ethical consumption under capitalism. As you mentioned, in your own website, and in your own book, there are a lot of different options and none of them are good, and a lot of people have their own reasons for doing things. And unfortunately, in a world like ours, which unfortunately doesn't have magic, so we can't magically cast a spell on Elon Musk and have him go away forever, we have limited options. Substack is a shitty platform that promotes shitty people. It's also one of the few platforms that actually pays writers. Kickstarter is a terrible platform that does not listen to its constituents or its creators. It's also pretty much a household name and is the reason why a lot of underground and marginalized voices have gotten their start to begin with. I'm not in the business of knocking, because we have to do what we have to do in order to fund our, to fund the extra, things we're doing to build our communities. We all live under capitalism. We have to make money. What I am going to ask is, does that quandary at all, does that battle to exist in a space in media that is actively hostile for anyone whose way of being in the world revolves around a system of morality at best, and is outright abusive to a lot of us, especially a lot of people of color like yourself and a lot of queer and trans folk like myself at worst? Does that feed into the story at all? Does that seep into your consciousness as you're writing? Because I know you make an effort to fight it by, creating a diverse cast and crew as far as the people who work on the book. Does that feed into your writing itself, though?
So I hear that question in two different ways. So I'm just going to answer, and I hope that you can hear my answer in time, and if that makes sense. Right.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
In one sense, yes, it plays a part in the way that I write, the way that I have crafted this world, because in some ways it's the nuance, it's the way that we justify, it's the way that we dance around these issues that allows us enough individuality to be who we are, right? So there's certainly, I could very easily write a very boring story where everyone in the story is evil because the world they live in is evil because it's controlled by evil magic fairies. That would be really fucking boring, because no one would have room to be themselves. And this is why I could tell that
it also doesn't seem like that would even jive with your way of being in the world.
And I was just about to say, this is why I'm so excited we're having this conversation, because this is the space that Ennead exists in, right? So and the other way that I hear that question is, again, yes, absolutely, this is where Ennead exists. And so when you talk about the issues with the platforms that I am using to bring Ennead into the world, again, there is no better choice. The other choice that folks who would not like who would like to live so far on either extreme, where I don't use Substack or I don't use Kickstarter, they more often than not don't recognize that means Ennead doesn't exist. Ennead only exists because I've been able to tap into the vehicle that is Kickstarter. I'm very aware that Kickstarter had an issue with the formation of a union, and they eventually seemed like they got that one right, whether it's because of public backlash or I don't know the details behind the scenes there, but at least they're on the right side of the coin there. The NFT issue is one that, for me, I think that while I understand the ecological impact that things like proof of work technology and Bitcoin and kind of this early cryptocurrency and blockchain technology presents, I also recognize that there are plenty of people in this space who are trying to work around that. And again, you talk about carbon offsetting and things like that, and some people say it's not good enough. Well, at the end of the day, whether or not carbon offsetting is or isn't good enough, the Amazon is still being cut down right now. So we have issues where, like, yes, that's not good enough, but you can't let perfect be the enemy of the good, right? If what we're doing is we're trending towards this kind of web 3.0 where NFTs and crypto are going to be a part of it, maybe a platform like Kickstarter, which is so reliant on its user base and its audience, navigating how to do this somewhat ethically is kind of going to give us the best model to use moving forward. I don't know, but that's what my response there would be in terms of Substack and the way that this, like I said, I'm hearing this question in two different ways, so I'm just going now. But Substack, right? And again, I am not immune to bigotry and its many forms. I recognize how it exists in the world, but I also recognize that the only way people like you and I can also exist in the world is that we claim our fucking space. Our space is ours, and wherever I want to be, that's my space. I don't care who else wants to be there. I don't care if you don't want me there. That's my space. And so very in the same way that I would in the real world if I wanted to go to a space again, and I'm not going to places where they're having clan rallies, right? Like I don't want to be there. But if I want to be someplace that I have the right to be, and there just so happen to be some racist assholes who also occupy that space, well, guess what? You have to deal with it because I know enough about who I am and where I want to be and how I want to exist in the world that I am claiming what's mine. And I think so much of my experience, and I'd imagine yours, as marginalized individuals living where we live, how we have, when we have, so much of our what would life be if you only existed in spaces where turfs didn't exist? What would your life be? How small would you have to be if you could only be you where everyone accepted you or where everyone thought like you? My world wouldn't be the world that it is. Your world wouldn't be the world that it is. You wouldn't be who you are if you didn't claim space for your own. And that's how I feel about Substack. And so when I take that all into the world of Amashik, that's exactly what each of these characters is doing. I mean, you talk about King Julius. King Julius is the just to insight into how the rule of nine works. Um, basically, Queen Ilaria was going to be queen no matter what, and they needed to, like always, make the kind of political arrangement and political marriage and put her with someone who would allow the third generation to make it from start to finish. So the second Ennead could start, and Julius Caesar was the pick, right? So you have that, and so that is something that is very prototypical, that political arrangement. But I made one small move and I flipped it. And I knew that I wanted the central focus of my story to be a matriarchy. And I knew I needed to have that because one, it's something that I feel strongly about. Two, I didn't want to tell a tired old story about a king with all the power who could fuck who he wants and kill who he wants and blah, 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 blah. But I think about that, right? And so now the way that their children, Micah and Udonis, who I referenced before, because of the way the rule of nine is written, they they have no right to the throne. They won't be passed down power unless their mother in particular has nothing to do with what their father wants, unless their mother in particular decides to say, to hell with the rule of nine, to hell with my grandmother's legacy. So now here we have two. I refer to Micah as the king that never was, because in most traditional kind of monarchies, he would have been the next ruler, but he's not going to be. So he's going to have to claim all of his space. Now that has nothing to do with bigotry or its many ugly faces. Has nothing to do with it. But it very much is the experience of going out into the world and claiming what's yours. And so in that way, yes, all of these things are very central to who I am as a person, who I am as a writer, the avenues that I do and don't choose to use, and my characters and the decisions they make. So, like, I love that fucking question, and I hope that was coherent enough. But
Yeah.
but that's how I heard that.
No, I mean, for one, I am very against NFTs. They tend to be very exploitive toward artists, and they tend to have a major ecological impact and all that. But with that stated, to go back to, like, there's no ethical consumption, and to go back to those ethical issues, there was an entire fucking point in time where if you wanted hormone replacement therapy in, like, the early 2000s, you had to buy it on places that only accepted Bitcoin because they were selling drugs. Like, there were entire swaths of trans people whose transitions were only possible via this, the nefarious shit that is cryptocurrency. You have all these different, platforms that unfortunately have decided to do all these nefarious shit by platforming notorious TERFs and bigots and all this other shit, or by signing, proverbial deals with the devil in order for the founders to cash out and leaving the rest of us in the dust, like with, what Bandcamp unfortunately did recently. But at the same time, you have, a lot of artists who would not have gotten a voice and would not have gotten paid if it not for joints like Bandcamp that were trying to consciously take a stand against other fucked up corporations like Spotify, which were not paying artists. Comics is very much, comics, illustration, music, media in general, as someone who does, has a foot in a lot of it, because unfortunately as a, trans woman, there aren't, without an education, I got kicked out of high school. There's not many fields that will have me. So I stick to media because this is one of the few places I have where I can make a living and eke out, claim my space, as you mentioned. But it's also very wrought with those types of ethical quandaries like, Substack and Kickstarter. So to close out the interview, because we are going a bit above an hour, number one, you're coming back.
Absolutely.
And because I haven't gotten a chance to talk about the art yet, you're bringing Luke Horsman with you, or you're bringing at least one of the artists with you, because I want to pick Luke's brain about these screen tones, because they are utterly immaculate.
So, just a point there, Luke is in the UK, so for Luke, it's about we're gonna have to get creative to get him on here. I would love to do it, but the timing's.
I'll stay up with it.
The timing's gonna have to get creative.
We just did an interview with Cruel Nature Records, like last week, and then the week before that, as my listeners know, we aired an interview with Doc Top from Headless Blood Idol, which, he's in Australia. Right. I'm down. What I'm saying is I'm up whenever. That's you.
It is.
With you up and I'm
Luke
up,
and I both,
we'll get him
Luke
up.
And I both have kids who are under 3, so I'll float the idea, but we'll see.
Yeah.
But that said, there are plenty of artists that I work with. Martin
on.
Nealon, I think he's in Sweden, so that probably would be a time zone issue. B Navarro, who just jumped on board for the color, she's down in Brazil. That would be a time zone issue. But Apple Nunez and Ed Lively are both here in the States, and I believe they're both where I am on the East Coast. So I think if we can,
so you got an incentive to come back. You're gonna bring God. We're gonna keep talking about this.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
I just wanted to plug all those names. That was all I really wanted to do.
No, definitely. Please do. And, please support. When this interview goes up on the YouTube channel, I will link all of the artists' individual websites. Please buy a copy of Ennead, Order of the Nine. It's on Kickstarter right now. Please go back it. And please, if you need art done after emailing me, please consider hiring them for your next project, because it's just a cavalcade of fantastic illustrators working on this project. But to close it off, because I've been meaning to return to this, you mentioned Jay-Z, and you mentioned you don't listen to black metal. Give me... I can't play most of it on the air, because I'm sure that a lot of it, is artists that I don't have explicit permission to play, and consent is important. We only play what's sent to us. But give me a playlist for any of the Order of the Nine, just to close us out.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Give me some music. Give me a soundtrack.
Can I give you a soundtrack for me as a writer? rather than
Yeah, that works too.
because
What do you normally listen to while
I'll give
writing?
you that. And it really I J. Cole is probably my favorite artist at the time at the moment, and
I fucking love
J.
J.
Cole.
Cole.
So Dollar in the Dream is definitely on the playlist. He's got a new track on the off season called Close. That's on the playlist. If I'm going to Jay Z, I'm going Forever Young. I'll probably throw in what else? If I had to get, Feeling It is definitely a reasonable doubt track that I want to throw on there if I'm going Jay Z. And then when I'm not listening to those two, I'm really not listening to much hip hop. So I'm listening to one of my favorite. Uh, they're kind of like a Southern Gothic folk duo. They don't play together anymore, but the Civil Wars, definitely one of my
Oh, I fucking love
Civil Wars
them.
are fucking amazing. Joy Williams is amazing.
Great.
John Paul White is amazing. They're amazing as individuals. I wish they were still together. But like, if you went to my like recent playlist, like it's those four artists like that. And there's
Hell
a
yeah.
dude out of the UK, Luke's in the UK. Shout out to Luke. Sam Tompkins, who is like up and coming, and he came across my radar recently. Beautiful voice. Sam Tompkins is definitely on there. He's got a song called Whole that just I feel like emotionally very, very connected to. Another one called Bloodline. So those are all things that are kind of in the spin. There's a gentleman by the name of Avi Kaplan who I just came in contact with via Joy Williams. He did a song with Joy Williams called All As Well. So like that's kind of that's me. That's kind of my mood music that I'm writing.
Hell yeah. And so we got the website, as I've already mentioned. We do have the Substack, which is enneadcomic.substack.com. The Kickstarter itself can be accessed probably most easily through your Twitter, which is
Ennead_comic.
Ennead_comic. We are TFAN_radio on Twitter. I am at Sarah Allen Reed. Thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to practice my radio voice for the next time.
That's why I'd say that's why they pay me the big bucks, but they don't pay me at all.
Another thing we have in
And
common.
that gotta love working in media. It's a wonderful profession. Please pay your artists. So yeah, that closes us out. Thank you for tuning in to The Forest at Night.